Notice to any family members or maybe close friends to James Franklin, you may want to get in contact with him. It is Ohio State week. All right. They'll be at the Shoe this Saturday, from what I understand, and it's a pretty big deal. Penn State, Ohio State. We got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts 247 Sports to help us break it down. Hey, Pat, how you doing?
I'm good. It's good to know what team Ohio State's playing this week, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, maybe if it's Akron, maybe if it's somebody of that caliber, maybe it slips the mind, possibly.
Right.
But we'll get to that in just a second. First of all, let's look back at this performance in Bloomington against Indiana. They're certainly one of the disappointing teams in the country and certainly in the Big Ten. So it can't be blown out of proportion what they're doing to the likes of Rutgers, Maryland, and Indiana. Still, nobody else is doing this to those teams. So Indiana is coming off an effort in which they're able to hang with Michigan State till the final 3 or 4 minutes of the game, only lose 20-15, turn around. And Ohio State, once again, it seemed like a we can name the score kind of game with 44 points in the first half.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I've taken away from these last few games is Ohio State's doing what the Buckeyes were expected to do this whole season. And obviously this year changed early on when you lose to Oregon, right? So that changed the perception of this team. But they've quickly gotten back on track, and it took a game or so and obviously some adjustments that we've talked about, but they've gotten back on track, and now they're doing what they did. If you look at the 2019 season, when Ohio State didn't play a game that was, I want to say, even within a two-score game the entire season. And obviously that changed when they got to the College Football Playoff and lost to Clemson. But it was just week after week. Okay, is this going to be the week they're tested? Is this going to be the week they're tested? Obviously, this Ohio State team was tested earlier in the season, but they've changed a lot since then, especially defensively. And I think that you're starting to get that kind of feel where maybe there's no one in the Big Ten, and we'll touch on this week against Penn State, but maybe there's no one in the Big Ten that's really going to challenge now that Ohio State's gotten things right. And obviously we'll see the second half of the schedule is much more difficult, but Indiana was a team coming into the year, as you mentioned, that thought was going to be a top 20 team. They were ranked that way in the preseason AP poll. Even after some of their losses, all of the losses that they'd had been to top teams. Most of them had been close or even closer if you watch the game than the final score indicated, but this Ohio State game wasn't. The Buckeyes went straight down the field and scored. Indiana then scored a touchdown. You thought, okay, maybe this offense will keep up for a little bit, and that didn't happen. Ohio State made a defensive adjustments, shut down tight end Peyton Hendershot, who had the opening touchdown. I think had 3 catches on that first drive and 2 catches for the rest of the game. And from there, like you said, Ohio State could basically pick the score. They took the foot off their gas in the second half. A lot of the starters were out by the end of the third quarter, and it was just, let's get to the end of the game there. Only 10 points in the second half, but like you said, when you put up 44 in the first half, 30 in the second quarter, you're pretty much cruising at that point, especially when your defense is making plays. So it's what I expected from Ohio State to begin the year. They didn't have that to start off, but I think they've really started to find that way to play, that momentum, all of those things, which, momentum is a big thing, obviously. And if you get that, you can kind of keep rolling.
And the offense is always going to get the attention when it's a score like that, and 44 points in the first half and all the big plays on offense. But 14 tackles for loss in this game against Indiana. And as you mentioned, after the opening drive score, of course, that was it.
Yeah, the defense is certainly playing much better. And I know that there's a lot of, like I said, who have they played? And Indiana was without Michael Penix, their starting quarterback. And I'm the guy who did start the game, Jack Tuttle, got hurt in this game. So, yes, it hasn't been a test, but just watching this defense play, they're flying around to the ball. The defensive line has started to get pressure these last few weeks. Now they're getting sacks and tackles for a loss. As you mentioned, I think they had 5 or 6 sacks in this game. So, it's just, again, the Buckeyes doing what they're supposed to do. Yes, they're playing inferior opponents. The Big Ten probably isn't as good. Definitely the first half of the season for Ohio State wasn't as good, but it's what you're supposed to do against teams like Indiana that are banged up, or a Rutgers or a Maryland. And the defense is a big part of that. It'd be one thing if Ohio State were scoring 50, 60 points and then still giving up 20, 25 each week, I think that's when you start to have questions. That's when we had some questions last year and at the beginning of this season. But at this point, holding Indiana to 128 total yards, they had 75 yards in that first play. So 128 yards for the game is pretty impressive, all things considered. And, we'll see. But I do think they're doing things better that, whether or not that works against elite competition, we'll find out. But it's definitely a better defense, more confident, those type of things than what we saw against Oregon and even Minnesota in week 1.
We've got an Ohio State live stream every Wednesday at 1:30 Eastern on our Ohio State channel. Please check that out. Pat Murphy joins us on a regular basis from Bucknuts 247 Sports. So please like the video, share the video out on social media, and subscribe right here at the Voice of College Football. And also check out Pat's work at Bucknuts 247. Yeah, we start this monumental stretch of play now in the Big Ten. This weekend, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State. So it's going to start to get sorted out. Now, Penn State, they've looked extremely good at times. They've got really good wins on their resume against Auburn in particular. Went to Wisconsin, who's starting to figure things out and is now going to be a factor in the Big Ten West. Then Sean Clifford gets hurt. They're unprepared against Iowa with a backup quarterback and Taquan Roberson, even though they somewhat dominated the game early, let that slip away as a 2-score lead, and then lose this mind-boggling game to an Illinois team that's arguably the worst in the Big Ten, or so we thought, that just beat them up front, and they lose in 9 overtimes. And so now Penn State certainly hobbling. They're missing some players on the defense is really good, but they're starting to get beat up on that side of the ball. Clifford's hurt. He's got rib issues. He seems to be compromised. It's not necessarily a Penn State team that's rolling into Columbus.
No, certainly not. And that was kind of the conversation with the Ohio State, Ryan Day and the Ohio State players today. And predictably, they said, this is still a very good Penn State team. Ryan Day and a couple of the offensive players pointed specifically to Penn State's defense, which has still played very well despite the losses. And these losses have been close. Obviously the game over the weekend against Illinois was 9 overtimes with the new college football overtime rule, where you have to go for 2 after, I think it's the second overtime. So a weird ending to that game, but that's an Illinois team that Penn State, a top 20 team, should certainly have won going away. I think at one point I think it was the third quarter, Illinois had 300 rushing yards, and I tweeted something about that they face Travion Henderson next week, who is one of the tops in the country in terms of yards per carry. So I think Ohio State should have no problem moving the ball offensively, whether that's on the ground or through the air. Though I think they will be tested a bit more in the passing game in terms of what Penn State has in terms of defensive backs. I think it's on the other side where, yes, this is the most like for like in terms of pure athletes that Ohio State's defense has faced. But as you mentioned, Sean Clifford, it sounds like he's going to play, but still banged up. He didn't look great last week in playing against Illinois. They don't have a ton when it comes to running the ball. It's been a mixed bag there. So, with Ohio State playing as confident as they are right now, as I touched on earlier, it's just not a good recipe for success. Obviously, this game is at Ohio Stadium. It's a night game, which this game in Columbus hasn't been a night game in several years now. They've always been night games at Penn State. So fans were certainly happy to see that. I'm sure it'll be juiced up at the Horseshoe. One of the Ohio State spokespersons said today they're expecting, a sellout 102,000, whatever it is now, the total capacity there. So a lot of things pointing in Ohio State's favor. I think it would be hard to pick against the Buckeyes in this one, but Penn State, as Ryan Day said multiple times today, Penn State has figured out ways to play Ohio State tough. And this easily, aside from maybe Oregon, is the most like-for-like talent matchup type game that Ohio State's played. And, they certainly won't just roll through them like they have some of these other games, even if they end up pulling away in the second half or something like that, as we've seen before.
Yeah, Penn State has certainly been the program since 2016. And, of course, the block kick and won the Big Ten championship miraculously and all that. That has been the closest to Ohio State in recruiting and on the field. They have given the Buckeyes the most difficult games by far. It's not even close to anybody else in the Big Ten. This particular team, though, is the closest, I still think, athletically, as you just mentioned, a few different ways, but got to take into account where the mindset of the team and the confidence level of the team is, and its coaching staff and head coach, who now famously, if you check out social media, used a few odd terms in referencing the shoe as the big house, which is, of course, in Ann Arbor, and referring to Ohio State as Illinois. We're focused on Illinois. Well, to even put that word with Illinois in the same sentence prior to the Ohio State game is rather ironic as well. And then there's a lot of news concerning, and of course, we understand that James Franklin has signed with Jimmy Sexton, and there are two huge head coaching job openings at USC and LSU. So we don't know exactly where. You got to think where the team's focused, but the head coach needs to be there too.
Absolutely. And I don't cover Penn State on a daily basis. I look forward to talking to some of our Penn State writers this coming week. But, just seeing some of the comments and having covered James Franklin a little bit at various events, you do have to wonder if maybe whether he ends up taking one of these jobs or not, just being linked with big name programs like that, if he's giving it some thought and maybe not spending as much time on what he's doing in State College. You would certainly hope not. You would like to think that even if he is considering those things, that those are being handled by agents and whatnot. You mentioned signing with a new agent there. So obviously things aren't going well. And maybe last week you could place some of the blame on there. And if things go poorly against Ohio State, I think that will certainly come up again. James Franklin has before confused team names in press conferences. So while that's funny, I don't think that is necessarily a sign that the team won't be focused on Ohio State, but it does just kind of show what's going on, that things aren't right. And obviously, let's not forget, this is a team that really struggled out of the gates last year. Now, a strange year for everybody involved, and Penn State certainly got it going back together by the end of the season. I think they won 5 straight games, 10 the year, whatever it was. But this isn't a program that has continued its dominance. Just under Ohio State in the Big Ten these last couple of years. It's been kind of a mixed bag of results for the Nittany Lions. So whatever the case may be, it's clear that things are weird. Now, if you can go and you beat Ohio State, everyone stops talking about that. Things are good again. It'll be very interesting to see, though, how they come out, how they play in Columbus, just kind of what the Nittany Lions look like on Saturday night.
Yeah, and to be fair to James Franklin, and it is funny, the memes and the various things that come out on social media to a certain extent. But to be fair to James Franklin, to Pat's point, shoot, I know from my experience sitting here talking for hours and hours and hours, there are things that come out of my mouth where I'm referencing a particular player that I know who that player is. I've watched him a million times, but I may, replace Jim for John or something like that and say the wrong name on occasion. So certainly we're all capable of doing that from time to time. No question about that. Pat, do you have any thoughts about, so we're recording 1 week prior to the initial college football playoff rankings release. And there is this huge debate. It's on my channel every day between Oregon and Ohio State. Oregon won the game. Ohio State looks to be the better team. Oregon plays in a conference that looks worse and worse by the week. Ohio State will at some point, otherwise the conversation's null and void, obviously, if they lose. So if they continue to win, their resume is only going to shoot through the roof and completely trump Oregon. So just your thoughts about what the committee may be showing us this initial release, granted if Ohio State gets the win this weekend.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see this first ranking for a number of reasons, but starting with what you said there about Ohio State and Oregon. I was talking to an Ohio State fan late last week about that situation. They were saying, they just hope Oregon loses to kind of get them out of the way. But I think at the same time, if Oregon ends up having a bad second half of the season, that loss doesn't look as good. You can also make the argument in 2014, Ohio State lost to a Virginia Tech team that turned out to be pretty poor and still made the playoff and won the national championship. I think right now, if you're Ohio State, you have to just focus on what you're doing. And I get the Oregon argument. And like I said, it will be interesting to see where both teams are ranked in that initial college football playoff ranking. But I think Ohio State has kind of put that out of the minds of at least the voters, obviously, in the AP and coaches poll. If the Buckeyes go out and beat Penn State handily this weekend, or even just a good win, I think that the Buckeyes will be right in that 4-5 spot. Now, whether that is fair to Oregon, I don't know. I think that the Ducks probably need to look better. Let's remember, it was only a 7-point game. As bad as some of the things looked in Columbus, it was only a 7-point loss. And so, I think that will be taken into account. And I'll be interested to see how the committee members that speak afterwards to us kind of evaluate and justify if they do have the Buckeyes higher. They always seem to have some response ready. But I think there's some other interesting things too, just while we're on the topic of the college football playoff. Where is Cincinnati ranked? I think that will be interesting. They've been number 2 in the AP and coaches poll, and that's obviously an in-state team with the Buckeyes. Ryan Day was asked about Cincinnati. Luke Fickell, former Ohio State head coach, who knows a lot of people here. There's a lot of people on his staff that are former Buckeyes. So I think it'll be very interesting to see, because we've not seen the Group of 5 team make it. Is that a team that could potentially be a roadblock for Ohio State? If they win out, and obviously they struggled a little bit this past weekend, but it'll be interesting to see that. It'll be interesting to see where Oklahoma ranks, because the Sooners obviously are undefeated, but these last few weeks have certainly raised some questions, almost, falling behind to Kansas. I guess they didn't almost lose. They pulled away in the second half. So I think it's going to be one of the more interesting first rankings we've seen. And it's always interesting to see where the committee has things, and it's always different than what the AP and coaches poll say. And that all kind of starts to work itself out. But I do think it'll be interesting. I think that it'll tell us a lot about what the committee thinks about Ohio State and coming back, and what they've looked like recently. Where does Oregon and the Pac-12 stand in things? The Big 12 and Oklahoma, and if Oklahoma's winning is good enough, and same thing with Cincinnati. So I'll be really intrigued next Tuesday. I think it's probably as intrigued as I've been going into a rankings, other than the final one, since this all started back in 2014.
On one hand, I believe that anybody who goes undefeated should be in a playoff, but that's if we have enough playoff spots. We don't have enough playoff spots. So, if we had 8 or 12, then yeah, come on in, you're undefeated. And especially with Cincinnati, all due credit to them, they went out and scheduled Indiana and Notre Dame.
Right.
At the same time, my goodness, Cincinnati's hanging on this Notre Dame, and I'm not talking about them specifically, but backers of Cincinnati are hanging on this Notre Dame win. Like, we checked off Notre Dame. That's all we need to do, as long as we win the rest of the games, where other teams across the country have to check off like 5 teams like that.
Right.
And it's not an equitable situation at all, but it will be fascinating, because Cincinnati's resume is going to do nothing but continue to drop.
Yep.
And the mentality of a lot of people is kind of like, once you mark your spot, like if you're Cincinnati and you're number 3, well, then you stay there regardless of what happens. I don't look at it that way.
Right.
I think the resume needs to be reevaluated every week.
Well, and that's what the College Football Playoff Committee is supposed to do. And that's what they tell us that they do, is every week is a clean slate, and they reevaluate these teams from scratch. So if you're doing that, and you certainly have to take into account that they did go and beat an Indiana team. They did beat Notre Dame. But those teams' strengths will also be evaluated each week. And so the Indiana game obviously doesn't carry as much weight now that the Hoosiers have lost, 5 games now. And obviously there you have a head-to-head comparison between Ohio State and Indiana also playing each other. So, that's why I think this ranking will be interesting. But then it's interesting every week, and obviously they make a show of it and whatnot. But this one will be interesting. I think if there are some losses, how teams move around. But ultimately, the one that matters, and the one that I think people should get worked up about potentially is that last one, when it decides who makes the college football playoff.
Absolutely. And I've said many times, and you're certainly aware of this, of course, that what's fascinating is that Ohio State, other than 2019 and 2020, as they filled that 3 line in 2020, but the first 5 years of this, they were the team of controversy every year. Yeah. They were on the 4-5 line every year. Interesting.
Yep.
All right, Pat, we appreciate you stopping by. Again, catch Pat's work at Bucknuts 247 Sports. Appreciate it. Enjoy the game.
Absolutely. Thank you.